Generally speaking, if we had given relief to households in 2009, 2010, the trajectory of our recovery would have been much better. Our economic situation today would have been much better.
I'm here today with Richard Begg, INET board member, managing partner of Gabriel Investments, and the chairman of the Governor Woods Foundation. We're here to discuss his new book, A Brief History of Doom, 200 Years of Financial Crisis. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you hit on the exact theme, which was the basis or the traumatic birth experience that led to INET being founded. And to stay with it, to build more evidence and so forth, I think is taking it further than we did in our first phase, and I think it's proving to still be a very important and potentially demoralizing subject, which you get to the heart of. But I want to know what inspired you? How did this project come to life?
Well, what INET does is so important. It's taking the failure of the conventional economics profession to predict the '08 crisis and trying to build a body of intellectual work around that and alternatives to it. I fully bought into what INET is doing, and I was out trying to show how things like the Great Depression and the '08 crisis were a function of runaway lending with compromised credit standards. And that message really wasn't getting out as much as I wanted it to, and I think as much as INET wanted it to. So I kind of said, well, let's get a little more serious about this. You know, if showing the evidence of 2 or 3 crises is not compelling, let's really get into this. And so we went back 200 years, and frankly, first to show ourselves, and hopefully now to show the larger community, that every one of the 43 major crises that we looked at in 6 countries over 200 years is predicated on the same thing, which is runaway, irresponsible, widespread lending that's creating overcapacity.
In the private sector.
In the private sector. It's a great point. You know, a lot of folks, even after the '08 crisis, for some reason started pointing their finger at government debt. It's essentially never government debt in larger developed countries. It's always the private sector's lending.
You are not, by history, an academic solely. You have a lot of practical experience in finance. You could smell the smoke when the fire was coming from your own sensitivities as a practitioner.
Well, I was a career banker, you know, up until just a few years ago. I started in banking in the late '70s and got out of banking because I saw the high signs that pointed to a global crisis. So sold my bank and got out of the industry in about '07, '08. So I've lived through a few crises, and I've been in the boardroom when we made the decisions, good, bad, or indifferent, about crises. So I do feel like I have a lot of, you know, visceral understanding of what's going on.
Yeah. And then when you go out and, look at the evidence, it's probably informed by that visceral understanding.
Absolutely.
Rather than wanting to get tenure or conforming to what the leaders in the profession have already said.
Well, that's a great advantage that I have, is I don't have to get tenure anywhere.
From a different place. That's great. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of indicators. You talk about the rate of change of debt in a sector or in aggregate. You talk about the level of debt in relation to GDP. And you have compiled this information across, like you said, over 40 crises. What are the things that we can see beforehand that should alert us to the, what you might call, impending or eventual crisis that will unfold?
Well, there's no magic formula, but we've looked at enough crises now that we have a rough proxy. It all boils down to the increase in lending, especially as in ratio to GDP. So our kind of rough calculus here is that if private debt in ratio to GDP grows by 20% in a 5-year period, red flags, alarm bells, whatever else should be going off. So for example, if private debt to GDP went from 140% to 168% in 5 years, the velocity, the acceleration is evidence that overcapacity is being created, and the loans that created that overcapacity are going to be bad loans. So, our it's 20% growth in private debt to GDP, and private debt generally has to be high in general as well. So we kind of have 150% of GDP is kind of a rough threshold.
So you probably have some emerging economies that just as they're starting to assimilate a financial sector from almost no debt, you could see them, what you might call getting into a credit system. That might not be as dangerous. But once it's a mature system, that rate of change is the real alarm.
Yeah, if you have 150% private debt to GDP, it probably means you already have ample capacity.
Right.
So an acceleration in lending means that you're going to be over capacity.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't mean that some younger economies haven't done exactly this same thing. So we find some crises that are highly memorable. The United States in 1837, Japan in the 1880s. As they're becoming industrial lending countries, they kind of have no clue as to how to lend, it seems. China in the 1990s is another example of that. And so bad loans are made rampantly in some of those situations as well.
You mentioned China. As we here in 2019 look out on the horizon, many people would say that the, what you might call analysis you've created is most applicable to the growth of debt in China. But in your book, I know you talk about that may be true, but that China is different. It doesn't sit and wait for a crisis in the private sector and then clean it up. They sometimes proactively, what I'll call remix property rights. And if they have the power to do that, the legitimacy at the level of governance, can they carry this on for a long time?
It's, I think, the most interesting question in economics today is China's lending is off the charts. They've created $20 trillion in what is effectively private debt or non-government debt. And there's also been that same kind of profligacy in what I would call their satellites, South Korea, Australia, Malaysia, and others. So we see problems building up there. But we looked at 1999 in China. At that point in time, China had been growing debt as rapidly as anyone ever has. And it looked like bad debt to loans in China was 30 to 40%. Well, in the United States, if a bank has 3 or 4% bad debt to loans, the bank's probably going to fail. And here's China at 30 to 40% bad debt to loans. But China is a maestro at dealing with these situations in a way that allows them to kind of muddle through. And in this case, China in the 2000, 2001, 2002 creates 4 bad banks to couple with the 4 large banks in China.
So this is in the metaphor of resolution of financial crisis. Good bank, bad bank. Bad bank is the repository for the restructured assets? Okay.
That's right. That's exactly right. They create 4 AMCs, asset management companies, and let the 4 Chinese banks sell their bad debt, about 20% to loans of their bad debt, to these AMCs, essentially at par. They threw in a little government subsidy, but that solved half or more of the problem at the stroke of a pen. Then China invested equity in those banks that doubled their capital. And that equity happened to be the excess reserves those banks were holding at the PBOC. So again, no money changed hands. You did those 2 things, and those 4 banks are almost completely really by the stroke of the pen. So China has shown that its legerdemain in these situations is far superior to what was done in Japan and the United States and other places.
That's an interesting challenge. I don't know how, what you might call the belief in a market system can be contrasted with that resolution mechanism when the scale of transfers is so high. In the United States, that would provoke a tremendous amount of resentment.
Well, you're right. China has an ability to intervene in these situations the United States doesn't have. And as you correctly pointed out earlier, the real question is how long can this be sustained? But in the United States, even the little amount we did comparatively to them, the Fed's balance sheet went from $1 trillion to $4 trillion. Even that amount created a resentment that we still feel today.
Oh, you see that when you interview people who say the Fed expanded the balance sheet to take the bad stuff off the balance sheets of the private sector finance, but they don't buy municipal debts as we're laying off police, not repairing bridges, and firing school teachers. They're picking winners.
Absolutely. And they weren't taking care of the underwater household, the households with underwater mortgages. So they took care of the banks, they didn't take care of the people.
Yeah, I know Tif Mian and Sufi, his co-author in House of Debt, talked about had you taken the debt down, you would have had to either recapitalize the banks, perhaps write down some of their creditors, but the people who have a marginal propensity to consume of about 100%, meaning the constrained mortgages, if they got some relief, their consumption would not have died out, and you wouldn't have needed as big a fiscal stimulus.
That's exactly right. Their work's brilliant, but generally speaking, if we had given relief to households in 2009, 2010, the trajectory of our recovery would have been much better. Our economic situation today would have been much better. And by my calculation, you really were only talking about $750 billion that you needed for this.
The other thing you might have is a faith in governance, that the polluters paid, people who created the mess paid, were penalized, and we might have more trust and faith in our political system than we have had in these ensuing years.
That's well said. That's very well said. The guys that created the problem got saved, the innocent victims didn't.
Right, and it's characteristic now for people to, when INET started, everybody said, well, Rob, you worked in finance and financial regulation. Mr. Soros is a genius in finance. Figure out how to patch up the governance of the financial sector and then we'll all get back to the game. Instead, what's happened is that what you might call corrosiveness of loss of faith in governance is not confined to the financial sector. Now the notion of expertise. Oh, you guys are all cheering for automation and we're all losing our jobs. Oh, you guys are talking about free trade and import penetration, but there is no compensation principle to make everybody better off and nobody worse off. Why are the economists all acting like ostriches? And we're in a very troubled spot. Expertise has lost its integrity, or the trust and faith in its integrity, and how we handle complex problems related to climate change and financial regulation, I believe does depend on expertise. But if you don't believe in it, how do we create credibility of governance again?
Well, you were talking earlier about credibility of government. To illustrate the depth of the problem, we're out talking to folks, and in a number of places along the way, we're talking to average Americans. These are intelligent people. These are good folks. And we'll have a little climate change discussion. And at the conclusion of our discussion, somebody will lean forward and say, I understand the government controls hurricanes. And somebody else in the group will say, I heard that too. So if you want to talk about distrust of government, credibility of government, in the face of a mounting problem, we got a problem. It's not just dealing with climate change, it's communicating about it, and communicating honestly about it.
That's it. Unmasking false perceptions or not investigating controversial topics is, how would I say, are both harmful.
Yep.
That's not what you did in this book. You went right down the throat of one of the central things that everybody knows in this last decade wasn't fair and wasn't done right. And I'm grateful to you for doing that.
Well, it was a real privilege, and all the support we received from you and all the great folks at INET was deeply appreciated.
Yeah. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.